Now, shifting gears into the next section, I would like to affectionately address these anti-capitalist capitalists, people that claim to disagree with capitalism, calling themselves post-capitalist, socialist in whatever case, but it doesn't matter. They offer critiques of the current system, highlighting its problems, yet when they start to describe what needs to be changed, you realize they're not really going after the system itself. And ultimately, in many cases, not understanding that money and markets are actually what define capitalism. And hence, money and markets are at the root of the negative market externalities these people try to stop. And as an issue of semantics, I'm reminded that I should really, in my own language, use only the term market economy and drop the word capitalism because of this very tendency. But I think I've clarified my point a lot, such as in my book, The New Human Rights Movement. Really, the terms are synonymous. But let's step back. So what is capitalism? The Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines it as an economic system characterized by private ownership of capital goods, investments that are determined by private decision, and by prices, production, and the distribution of goods that are determined by competition in a free market. The truth of the matter is this basic definition is really only a snapshot of the emergent institutional and conceptual development of the system, meaning it's part of a larger pattern of development rooted in the most basic mechanics of market economics itself. Let's consider some history. We see trade, money, and markets as a shared economic feature in all large-scale economic practices going back to antiquity. Thousands of years ago, ancient Greece had open markets, money-based trade, private property, and the like. Even though there's variations to that, even though, for example, they had things like slavery, which many theorists argue simply can't be part of the capitalist mode of production, as capitalism is deemed to require voluntary labor exchange, like wage labor, meaning the buying and selling of labor power, not direct slavery coercion. And if you wish to be a Harvard graduate economist, this is what you're trained to believe, drawing lines that in truth do not exist. The distinction between slave labor and so-called voluntary wage labor exchange is not a distinction at all, but a variation on a theme. If a society is constructed by which your survival requires you to submit to servitude in some form, by force of the structure, whether dealing with a king, a feudal lord, or a corporate CEO, and you're not going to be able to survive without that submission, by definition, it's not voluntary at all. Likewise, if the relationship of labor power means another person is going to gain advantage off of the fruits disproportionately, it is hence not a mutually beneficial transaction either, in the sense of equal gain. In other words, it is inherently exploitative, as all market transactions are. In other words, it's not the specifics that matter, it's the structure of social relations, as I will describe. Remember, history is written by the winners. People that promote capitalism definitely don't want to admit that the economic incentives for abject slavery, regardless of any political, religious, or social tradition overlap, is absolutely coherent with market economics and hence capitalism. For what is the economic purpose of cheap or affordable or low-cost labor costs or competitive labor costs? Cost efficiency. Slave labor extracts 100% surplus value, minus the basic cost of food and shelter for the enslaved, while modern wage labor, which the vast majority of workers today are involved, is merely a variation of this. Whether earning minimum wage and barely surviving or working a high-paying corporate job, all workers exist within the same fundamental structural relationship, serving the interests of those extracting disproportionate gains in the interest of cost efficiency. This is about relationships of the structure, not a snapshot of what the system structure has manifested qualitatively or invariance at any given point in time. Hence, it's no surprise that according to basic United Nations standards, there are today in the capitalist world more slaves than any time in human history, based on absolute numbers. Now, let's step back for a moment and better frame this perspective. What I'm explaining here is, in systems science lingo, what you call structural invariance or organizational invariance, which means the root or organizational architecture of a system remains the same, but various contextual differences make the behavior appear different on the surface as things change. The reason people maintain a myopic definition of capitalism, not understanding that it is the active manifestation of monetary market economics, is because of the superficial differences they are trained to observe are just that, superficial. It's all about custom definition. Like a person jumping on a trampoline and a photo of them is taken when they are midair, and you don't see the trampoline. You don't see anything. You just see that snapshot in time. You don't know the dynamics, even though you can infer, but it's just a snapshot. That's people's frame of reference today when they define capitalism. Now, going back to Greek antiquity, major urban centers like Athens were bustling trade hubs. The market economy in ancient Greece was robust, even though different in terms of peripheral attributes, that snapshot once again. The main difference between the capitalism of ancient Greece and the capitalism of today was the degree of emergent adaptation, clouded within cultural factors. But the core system, the endogenous development of money and markets, it's there, and it makes those peripheral cultural influences far less meaningful than market theorists today would have you believe, as they try to box in some rigid definition of the capitalist mode of production. This is also what you could call a proto-capitalist perspective, if people want to research that, meaning an evolutionary perspective that links common threads of prior variations. Consider feudalism. Feudal structures, while different, still had the same embryonic elements, money, markets, merchant finance, which evolved into modern capitalism as we know it, including continuity of social relations once again, with dominant classes appropriating economic surplus. Again, the core difference between today and back then has to do with older cultural factors interwoven within this multi-stage adaptation of markets. The practice of monarchy and the powerful role of religion, for example, were both complementary and conflicting, depending on how you look at it, forging historical variations of the economic system one way or another. And there are certain erosions and amplifications that happen in this process over time as well. For example, in the age of feudal monarchy, obviously not everything was for sale. You had the divine right of kings owning vast domains, absent market dynamics. This element was indeed eroded out over time in most places on Earth today, and predictably so. Today, essentially everything is for sale, sanctioned or not, in the spirit of free enterprise. That's the new mode of thought on the globe. Why? Because the idea of having everything for sale is more coherent with the foundation of the market system in general. And the system has grown increasingly more dominant as time has gone on. Some may remember a quaint book I've referenced a few times, What Money Can't Buy, The Moral Limits of Markets by Michael Sandel, where he talks about the increasing marketization of life, how we have gone from a market-based economy to a market-based society. And this tracks with the emergent pattern we've seen going back centuries. For example, today, people constantly argue about politics not having money in it, how we have to get big money out of politics, or maybe just money entirely out of politics. The common sense position that no, money should not be influencing policy about people's everyday lives, but it does. And the question is, why do we consider this to be off limits? What is it about this market economy that we trust these dynamics of money and markets on everything, but not in the government sphere? Well, we all have common sense with that. We know what the problem is, but if you think about it, it's completely inconsistent with the dominant structure we are inside of once again, which is why slowly but surely the power of money and markets prevails, not democracy, not common sense. It's inconsistent for money and markets not to be involved in politics and legislation because that would be the only domain left that didn't utilize market forces. Which also explains why laissez-faire economists, modern libertarian mindsets once again, see the state apparatus as a foreign entity that interferes with the purity of their market religion. It's not natural. The system has evolved to not understand any type of human activity that isn't embraced by market forces, which is also, once again, why democracy is fundamentally incompatible with market economics and hence capitalism, unless one's idea of democracy is the freedom only to buy and sell without concern for anything else. Forget the well-being of society, forget the habitat. It's the invisible hand of the market. And that's kind of the implication of those that continue to invoke that kind of self-regulation. And once again, it reinforces the trajectory that we see. The destruction of regulation, policy, and even the most basic role of government is occurring. It's an erosion process. The system wants to get rid of the regulatory apparatus and let the true dynamics of the aristocracy of capitalism flourish. That is literally what everything suggests in this emergent adaptation. What is happening right now with the Trump administration, with Elon Musk and all of these characters? They are gutting the entire governmental system. It's all part of that general sensibility. They have other reasons, but it's all part of that general sensibility that government is this interference. It's not really democracy, it's something else. It's a very clever distinction, because if you're against government, you're against democracy itself by default. So the trend is clear to see. We're moving towards modern oligarchy, a modern adaptation, amplifying oligarchy, I should say. Rapid consolidation of power in the United States right now. And this is just what we can expect as this evolution continues, this emergent adaptation. It's not a side effect or a bastardization or an abomination that capitalism produces, oligarchs, monopoly, and highly anti-democratic features by extension. That is simply what the system does, in truth. Hence, back to my point, while we recognize that this capitalist mode of production has certain outstanding properties today, particularly the idea of free exchange, investment, capital accumulation, the buying and selling of production means, so-called free labor once again, and so forth, all of that was simply under the surface as a latent potential, if you will, as the system has evolved. For example, in the Middle Ages, as time went forward, feudal lords increasingly demanded monetary rents instead of in-kind labor. And in some cases, the peasants had to enter the market to sell produce or labor to obtain currency. This shows the adaptation. You start to see the bridging in that proto-capitalist perspective. And to complete this point, let me just break this down into the core adaptation properties, if you will, that I think, if anything, are at the root of people seeking change. I would reduce it all down to two basic problems that exist throughout the root structure: built-in exploitative human abuse and built-in infinite growth necessity, and hence environmental abuse, the consumption society. No matter the historical variation in the utilization of markets, no matter what kind of regulatory policies are attempted, the market system endogenously moves toward elitism through exploitative human abuse, which is hierarchy and oppression producing, coupled with the necessity of constant consumption and growth, and hence environmental abuse. It's not a question of if, but a question of when, as industry becomes more productive over time. Now, more specifically to exploitative human abuse, which occurs either on the interpersonal level or the intergroup level, it is inevitable, as there is no collaborative form of market economics. The structure of social relations are immutably antagonistic, even in, say, a business cooperative, where everyone earns an equal share of profits and wages. That seemingly egalitarian internal structure does not isolate the enterprise from the broader system. Markets systematically pressure all producers, cooperative or otherwise, to keep costs down, including labor costs, in order to maintain competitive edges and hence profitability. This cost reduction incentive, required for all businesses, cooperatively operated or not, forces exploitative abuse for cost efficiency somewhere down the supply chain, somewhere down the labor chain. The only exception would be completely isolated cooperatives that employ, source, and produce from within a closed or semi-closed network, if we're talking about transition, that is not market-based at all, which, by the way, is exactly what the Integral project is designed to do, allowing for truly non-competitive cooperatives that network together without cost efficiency exploitation in the network alone, both on the level of resource access and labor access. And of course, I could say much more about that. Point being, market economics is underpinned by the need for surplus generation, and a defining factor generating that surplus is cost efficiency. It doesn't matter what permutation you come up with. This holds true in any type of economy that uses markets, because it's all about angling imbalance, if you will. Hence the innate competitive nature, seeking weakness in exchange. Now, for the second shared attribute I listed, of all market-based economies, guaranteeing environmental decline, the system simply requires perpetual turnover and consumption. There is no other option. This is both obvious and profound. Nobody is ever going to sit back with any kind of market-based organization and be incentivized to want less people to buy their stuff and have less income coming in. I challenge anyone to come up with a market economic scenario, regardless of the period of time, where there is this system-level rewarded incentive to slow production and consumption. It doesn't exist because the root basis of the entire idea of market economics is the selling of labor to infuse with capital goods, to produce something to sell, which someone has to buy repeatedly for the cycle to remain stable. And hence, it is only through a non-market-based collaborative system a society can be allowed to relax and not be forced to produce just for the sake of producing, to keep money moving, and hence the market system afloat. Before we move on, since all of this has been said, let's now more accurately define this thing we call capitalism. Capitalism is the evolving institutional manifestation of market economics using a medium of exchange, money and price, endogenously leading to private ownership of production means, profit-seeking through required competition, expressing a condition of social relations rooted in dominance hierarchy, and a positive reinforcing feedback loop requiring infinite resource consumption. That's capitalism. And allow me to describe a little bit of that kind of developmental, situational determinancy. If you took a group of people and dropped them on an island and set in motion the process of market trade, using a medium of exchange and hence the creation of price values, etc., the first thing to realize is that the very idea of property, it's inherent, right? You can't have market trade without property. With the medium of exchange creating the bridge for that property exchange, and hence the invention of prices. Boom, the price mechanism. From there, the individual realizes the inherently competitive nature of the game that's been born, having to sell something to someone else repeatedly to survive. They must position themselves to reduce costs and maximize demands at every turn, no matter what level of economic engagement. That is just the logic of the game. A seller wants to get the most, while the buyer wants to pay the least. Doesn't matter if it's a piece of land, labor, an apple, etc. A competitive construct. And from that construct, new inferences emerge, including the rise of private ownership of the means of production, right? That can be a single person with a farm selling produce to his small town, or a massive corporation with a network of office buildings and factories. In fact, as an aside, there's no condition where there would be such a thing of true public ownership of the means of production in a market system, unless your definition is simply government control of industry. Government ownership is not synonymous with public ownership. In reality, government just becomes another business or company, a monopoly of sorts.